We'll get started. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are all in for a fantastic treat this afternoon. As you see, Walter has morphed into a guest speaker for just the hour and a half here.
Shorter and fatter.
But very entertaining. I don't know how to respond to that as an introducer. This is Charles Fallhaber, who is a professor of medieval Spanish literature and has a doctorate in Romance philology. You can ask him what that is, maybe at the end of the talk. And also, most importantly these days, from my understanding, he is the director of the Bancroft Library. So we are all in for a great treat. I saw this talk last year. I'm told that it is a little bit has been added to it, and so I'm confident it will be even better than it was. A couple of things before we get started in the way of administrative whatnot. You'll see you've got flyers for this summer's big history class at the end of each table. What we would appreciate if you would grab some of these, hand them out to your friends, post them in wherever it is that you people live, and try and get a good turnout for David Shimabukuro, who will be teaching the class this coming summer. Related to that, Walter won't be here on Thursday, so we've decided to cancel class entirely. He just sent out an email to that effect, so we will have no class on Thursday. And instead, he's asked that you watch the TED Talk, to which this flyer alludes. It's David Christian's talk that's available on TED. Are there any questions about those things? Okay. So we were just getting up and started here, and let me turn it over to Charles Fallhaber. Everybody give him a round of applause.
Thank you very much. If this infernal machine ever decides that it wants to do something, we can get started here. Okay, here we go. Okay, so when Walter asked me to talk about this, actually, a couple of years ago, and he wanted me to say, no, talk about language history. Well, I don't, do all that. I don't do language history in the abstract. I do and the linguistic history of the Roman Empire is a little bit exaggerated, but what we really focus on are the Romance languages, and that's what Romance philology deals with, the history of the Romance languages. It doesn't have anything to do with love, although one of my colleagues used to get letters about that sorts of stuff. Language history is a lot like geological history. You cannot see the processes going on unless we have a major earthquake, and you don't even have that in language history. So what we pretty much have to do is infer from evidence in written text, for example, or from the languages on the ground today, what actually happened in the past. And languages, when we study this, we study two different aspects: the external history, and these are the factors which influence language change. For example, peoples in contact. Two language groups come into contact, speaking different languages, and both languages change because of the intermixture. And you see this as most noticeably in Spanish and English in Mexico, for example. Indo-European migrations were enormously important for the evolution of Latin and its gradual change over time into the Romance languages. The Germanic invasions, the Germans were pushed west by the Huns and the Mongols, and eventually pushed the other languages out as they came into Western Europe. Geography plays a big part. If you've got a mountain range, the people on one side are going to be speaking differently than the people on the other side. Rivers are both ways to get places, but they're also barriers. And the Alps, the Pyrenees, the Rhine, the Loire are linguistic boundaries even today. And finally, the center versus the periphery. And for the Romance languages, that's Rome, basically. Rome versus the colonies at the far ends, Portugal on the west, what is now Romania on the east. The center tends to be more dynamic. Languages change faster. Was that a...
I forgot to ask you before introducing, would you prefer that people hold their questions to the end, or do you want to let people...
Let's do them in, as we go along. Because if you don't get something, then it kind of builds on what I'm saying. So yeah.
Please do ask questions.
So languages. So Latin changed most in. That's not quite true, but Italian and French, which are sort of the center of what became the Carolingian Empire, were much more dynamic, whereas Portuguese and Romanian tend to be much more archaic in a lot of different examples. And I'm going to be talking about all of this in a lot more detail. Administrative divisions. We can still see the provincial divisions of the Roman Empire in the way the languages are configured today. But toward the end of this, I'm going to be talking about the internal history of the language. So when we talk about language history, up until the end of the 18th century, it was pretty impressionistic. And it tended to be looked at, Italian is better than Spanish because Italian is closer to Latin. But the British conquest of India, capture of Calcutta, 1757, Sir William Jones, who was a justice, essentially worked as a lawyer, but in his spare time he started studying Sanskrit, and like all well-educated Englishmen of the period, he knew Latin and Greek, and he started to see that there were certain patterns between Sanskrit, Latin, and Greek, and he posited that these patterns could be explained as if they were descended from an earlier language, which eventually came to be called Proto-Indo-European. And the way, and linguists still work on this today, using exactly the same, the comparative method. In other words, you look at the daughter languages and you try to figure out what do they have in common, what must the mother language have been like. And since we're using that word, so let's take the word mother, for example. In Celtic and Old Irish, madir, Germanic, Gothic, modar, Hellenic Greek, mater, Albanian, motar. I don't know any of these languages. Indo-Iranian Sanskrit, matar. And the reconstruction is something like that. The star means it is a reconstruction. It's not attested anywhere. Something like meter in the original Indo-European language. What's missing in the middle? Well, what's missing in the middle is, we will see, Portuguese, madre, Spanish, madre, Catalan, mera, Provençal, mera, French, mère, Italian, madre. So you do that same kind of reconstruction, and you can get back to the mother language for the Romance languages, which of course is Latin. We don't have to do that though, because in fact we have a very large corpus of written material from Latin, and we know that it was mater. But then you get something like Romanian, mama. That doesn't come from mater. That is essentially baby language. In other words, this is, mama, ma, mom, the kind of thing that kids say becomes the standard word for mother. Portuguese has the same thing, mãe, as an alternate form for madre. So that's the kind of thing that linguists do when they're studying language change. They use this comparative method. And one of the things, especially when you start going back, is how do you relate a language to the people who spoke it? So we have language change itself. Linguistic, sound changes, the evolution of sounds from one language to another. Social organization, tribes, for example, vocabulary. One of the things that is, I'm going to go into this, but then the archaeological evidence And when you're getting back 2,000 years ago, practically all you have is archaeological evidence. So you can look at tomb cultures. You can look at the kinds of artifacts that you find in tombs, and you can say, okay, these are from the same group of people, even though you might find them in Asia Minor in one place or in at the end of France, and they're Celtic. The domestication of the horse, we know that happened roughly around 2000 BC, and so you can start to see artifacts, bridles, horseshoes, parts of chariots, especially when we get into the Bronze Age. And increasingly, we're starting to use genetic evidence, and the people are wanting to say, okay, we know that groups came out of Africa. Africa is the home of the human race, in successive ways of migration. And these are very small groups of people, typically, but you're looking at the genetic relationships, you can figure out, and especially the mitochondrial DNA, which is the mother's relationship. There wasn't an original Eve, and you can take it back, the gene pool back to her. Just this past week, there was a story in the New York Times about a statistician, the guy who does statistical linguistics in New Zealand, who is trying to correlate the origins of human language. And he has come up with a theory relating the number of sounds in a given language to what he posits as the original place of origin. And he looked at another different possibilities. He finds it in Southwest Africa, right here. And the richest languages in terms of number of sounds are things like Bantu. They have over 100 sounds. And the farther away you get, the fewer sounds there are, until you get over to the Hawaiian Islands, which were essentially isolated. Hawaiian only has 15 sounds. English has about 45. So and of course that's there. So, and by what does he mean by sounds? Sounds, not any sound, but sounds whose change makes a difference. These are called phonemes. So, for example, and the way linguists figure out how many phonemes there are in a language is they look for minimal pairs. In other words, words which are exactly the same except for one sound. So if you take a word like bat and cat and fat and sat and rat, all of those initial consonants are phonemes because you change it and you change the significance of the word. So that's the first thing they do, is establish this phonemic repertory of sounds. And on the basis of that, this linguist has come up with a very clever way of correlating distance from the point of origin and the number of phonemes. And the explanation is that when a group migrates, it tends to be a very small group of people, so you're going through a kind of funnel. And the amount of diversity, either genetic or linguistic, in that funnel gets smaller and smaller the farther you go. So that when you get to there is much less genetic diversity in the native Hawaiian population than, let's say, in Northern European. And it's the same kind of thing in linguistics. This is something I cannot answer questions on because I'm not a statistician. So I'm basically, but it's kind of interesting to see the way that the genetic information and linguistic information is starting to be correlated. I didn't change this slide because it's roughly 4,000 to 1,000 BC. Yeah.
I'm sorry, you might have said this, but I didn't quite understand. Why would people have less diversity in phonemes as they go farther?
Because they're very small. In other words, if you have a very large population, thousands of people, the genetic diversity, linguistic diversity is going to be fairly great because they're speaking different dialects of the same language. Whereas if it's a very small group of people, they're all going to have roughly the same genetic background, and they're all, let's say, a given family, and they're also going to be speaking exactly alike. So you don't have the range of sounds that you would have in a much larger group.
Is that the same thing as the founder effect?
Yes, exactly. You want to explain what the founder effect is?
Isn't that when like there's like a parent large population and like a smaller population that's less genetically or linguistically diverse
Yeah.
goes off into another
Yeah.
area?
So each of these founding groups is smaller and smaller. I mean, has less linguistic or genetic diversity. In some senses, this is exactly what happened in the United States. If you look at the dialects on the eastern seaboard, we can tell who's from New York, who's from Boston, who's from the South. The farther west you go, the less dialect variations they are. Part of this is because it's leveling, mixing, people coming from different regions, but it's also because people came in small groups and they all tended to speak alike. So the Indo-European tribes started from this area basically in the steppes of southern Russia and the Ukraine, and then they moved east and south to India. They moved west into Greece. They moved west into the Italian peninsula. They moved farther west into France, and then north to the Scandinavian countries in Germany. Up until now, people say, well, this roughly started around 4000 BC. This guy who's statistical information I've just tried to replete says he puts this much farther back, put it about 10,000 years ago instead of 4,000 years ago. And this will be something that the linguists will be trying to discover. So roughly 2nd century BC, the Indo-Europeans covered this particular area. And so we've got the Hittites, the Babylonian, the Mycenaean Greeks. Egyptian is not an Indo-European language. Germanic, Celtic. 1,000 years later, the Iranian and Indo-Aryan languages have spread from, along with the cultures, have spread from Asia Minor all the way to to India. And you've got the Dravidian languages here in the south, where they still are today. But Hindi and Sanskrit are Indo-European languages. Then Greek, Italic, Celtic, Germanic up here, Slavic, Balto-Slavic in this area, Russian, Finnish, Hungarian, and then the Italic languages. So Latin is only one of the Italic languages spoken essentially in the area around Rome. But all of these other languages occupied parts of the Italian peninsula. Etruscan is a non-Indo-European language, and it is still very poorly understood. But Oscan is Indo-European. It's a sister language to Latin. Umbrian. Greek was spoken down here in Sicily and in the toe of the Italian peninsula, and in fact there are still Greek-speaking regions in southern Italy. Latin is first attested in the 7th century. The mythical origin is 753 BC, the founding of Rome and the legend of Romulus and Remus, and of course this is what Virgil mythologizes in the Aeneid, where he has the original Romans fleeing from Troy, the Trojan War, and establishing the city of Rome. Rome is, first of all, it is a kingdom. Then it becomes a republic. And the expansion takes place over a course of roughly 500 years. Rome gradually conquers the Etruscans, the Gauls, who are in the northern part of Italy, the Samnites, the Greeks in the south. Major event are the Punic Wars with Carthage. Where is Carthage, by the way? It's in the news today. It's Libya. I mean, this has been a battleground for 2,500 years. The Carthaginians were traders, the Romans were fighters. The Carthaginians never stood a chance over a series of 3 Punic Wars. This is Hannibal crossing the Alps with his elephants and fighting in against Rome for 15 years before he's finally defeated. And at the end of the Second Punic War, the Romans essentially destroyed Carthage. There was a series of one of the great speeches, Carthage must be destroyed. Carthago delenda est. And they sold the inhabitants in slavery, sowed the fields with salt, and destroyed it as a civilization. During this period is the first time the Romans actually leave the Italian peninsula. They start in Spain as a battleground. During the Second Punic War, the part of the battle is in Spain, but Spain is not actually conquered until 19 BC under Caesar Augustus. And Julius Caesar conquers Gaul, what is now France. So the Roman Empire basically starts with Caesar Augustus, lasts for over 400 years. So here we are, roughly 180 AD, and you can see the early part here is conquered early on. Dacia is conquered in the first century AD. Britain is conquered about the same time, first century AD, and the entire shore of the Mediterranean, Greece, Asia Minor. This is where the Romans come into contact with the Persian Empire. And here's Egypt. So Cleopatra and Mark Antony and Caesar. Cleopatra being the last native pharaoh. And this is the greatest expansion of the empire in the roughly 400 AD. But what's interesting is that you've got all of these Germanic peoples, the Ostrogoths, the Franks, the Saxons, sitting on the northern border. And what Rome has to do during this period is maintain its border fortifications. There's constant low-level war between the Germanic tribes on the north and Rome. The Rhine is basically the dividing line. And these Germanic peoples are tribes. They are in contact with Rome for roughly 300 years. So there is a lot of cultural contact that's going on. And the situation is relatively stable for this time. And then what happens in the 5th to the 7th century are pressure on the Germanic tribes from the east, from the Mongols, the Huns. We don't even know who the Huns are. But these various tribes start moving into the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire has been basically crumbling of its own weight. The Vandals and Suevi, the Alani are tribes that invade Spain. The Vandals, now they go all the way through Spain. They cross the Strait of Gibraltar and wind up in North Africa in what used to be Carthage. The Visigoths sack Rome, 410 AD. This is sort of the effective end of the Roman Empire, and establish a kingdom in France and in Spain, with the eventual capital in Spain in Toledo. Last Roman Empire, 476 BD. The Ostrogoths, the Eastern Goths, occupy Spain in the first half of the 6th century. The Burgundians in what is now Burgundy in eastern France, and then the Franks in Gaul. Let's take a look at some of this. So all of these are the movements of the various tribes over a period of about 2 centuries. So we've got the Vandals who come all the way down here to Carthage again, and then go back to Spain, back to the Balearic Islands, back to Sicily, back to Sardinia, and even over to Greece. The Visigoths start again roughly from this area all the way down into Greece, sack Rome, leave Rome, come back, and eventually establish their kingdom in Spain. The Huns come east and then come into contact with the Franks. And we have the Battle of Chalon in 451, where the Huns are, in fact, this is Attila, are defeated by the Franks, and the Franks settle in what we now call France. And that's obviously where the name comes from. The Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes, Germanic tribes invade England. King Arthur is a Roman citizen trying to fight against the barbarians in the 6th century. And that is the nucleus of the Arthur tale. The Visigothic on a little bit, so here we are, 50 years, these, and we're probably talking 50 to 60,000 people who are not continuously on the march, but moving all the way through this area until they finally wind up in Spain. And they become the upper class, and they're ruling over the basically Latin citizens of Spain, or the Latin citizens of the south of France, or and so you've got these two languages in contact, or more. You've got Latin, which is spoken by the original, well, these are not the original inhabitants, these are the inhabitants that came in with Rome. And then you've got an upper class. So you've got a situation of bilingualism, and you've also got, which is basically people who can speak two languages. And although one language is usually dominant, people tend to speak their native language better than the language that they've learned. Secondly, and you've also got a situation of diglossia, which is essentially the same word as bilingualism, except it's Greek, where the two languages are used, but they are different. One language is used typically for administrative purposes, and the other language is the language that people speak in everyday life. In Egypt, for example, from the death of Alexander the Great through the 2nd or 3rd century AD, Greek was the language of administration, and Egyptian was the language that people spoke every day. We know, one of Bancroft's most important collections is papyri, which were excavated from a little town about 60 miles southwest of Cairo. So we've got literally thousands of parchment. Most of them are in Greek, because this was the language of the educated elite. We do have some in Egyptian. Originally, the Visigoths occupied, both south of France and then and Spain. But the Franks in 507 AD pushed them out of France, and they stayed for 2 centuries in Spain. So here we are after the Roman Empire. We've still got these Iranian Indo-Aryan languages over in the what is now the Middle East and India. Turkic languages still spoken in Turkey. Armenian, Slavic over here, Germanic, and essentially the Latin languages. And so we think of the Latin Empire as being very large, but in fact, in comparison to the Eurasian landmass, it wasn't all that large. Celtic spoken on the far fringes of the Roman Empire. And the Celts came before the Germans. We're talking about before the birth of Christ. And there were Celtic peoples in what is now Asia Minor. Breton is still spoken in the western part of France. Irish and Gaelic in Scotland, Irish in Ireland. Those are the remnants of the language. These were the peoples that were pushed out by the Romans in these migrations. So the end of the 6th century, there is a new political order in Europe. But what's starting to happen in the southern part of the Mediterranean is the expansion of Islam. So Muhammad dies in 632. By the time he's dead, Muslims have conquered the entire Arabian Peninsula. Over the course of the next century, actually it's less than that, 50 years, they expand into as far as Iran, where they come into contact with the Sasanian Empire. And then up again to what is essentially Libya and Tunisia. Bancroft also, we've got a set of documents from the Sasanian Empire from the 6th, 7th, 8th centuries just before and just after the Muslims take over. And there are about 3 people in the world who can read these. So they started something. What are they? They're tax documents. We have a bureaucracy. I mean, this is receipts. You've got so many camels. This is what your tax is, and you paid it. Here's your receipt. Yesterday was tax day, so sorry. That's fine. And under the Umayyad Caliphate, which was centered in Baghdad, then you get this expansion farther east and also all of North Africa and then into Spain. And one of the things that we should remember is that in the 9th century, Baghdad was probably the most civilized city in the world. It was the center of science and art and literature, which is, I won't go there. So the Muslims in Europe, the conquest, the jump over the Strait of Gibraltar in 710, the Battle of Salalo in 711, where the Visigothic kings and nobles are defeated by the Muslims. The Jabal Tariq is the leader of the Muslim forces. He was Arab. Most of the troops were Berbers from north of Africa. And that's where the name Gibraltar comes from. It is Jabal's mountain, literally. The first time the Muslims are defeated, they conquer the entire Iberian Peninsula in less than almost the entire Iberian Peninsula in 7 years. The first defeat comes in 718 in a little valley in Asturias, where Professor Alvarez family comes from. And then they push past that across the Pyrenees into France, and then are defeated in 732 by the grandfather of Charlemagne. That's kind of the high water mark. And then from then on, over the next 8 centuries in Spain, you have the reconquest, pushing the Muslim troops back. In Italy, they occupied Sicily for almost 2 centuries. So by the time this process is more or less crystallized in, let's say, the 9th or 10th centuries, you've got 2 major divisions of the Romance languages in Europe. You've got the Western Romania, in other words, northern Italy, France, northern France, southern France, Provence, Spain, which is the Iberian Peninsula, which becomes Portugal, Castilian, Catalan down here. And then you've got Eastern Romance, which is southern Italy, and Romania. This area was at one point Eastern Romance, but it has since become entirely Slavic. The line of demarcation is called La Spezia Rimini line. La Spezia here on the west and Rimini on the east coast of Italy. And what this is an isogloss with, where a line on one side of which certain sounds are found, or certain phonetic features or linguistic features, and on the other side, other linguistic features. So the 2 major distinctions that linguists use between Western Romance is, how is the plural formed? In Latin, it's with an S, homines, for example, which gives hombres in Spanish, this is the 12th century spelling of French, it still had a final S. Versus in the East, you use the I ending, the final S is lost. So, uomini in Italian, and Italian still does not use an S to indicate a plural. The other thing is that these unvoiced consonants like t, k, p, when they're between vowels, soften. Process called lenition. So vita in Latin becomes vida in Spanish, vi in French. The T becomes D and finally drops out entirely. Or focu, fuego, fire. Fogo in Portuguese, fuego in Spanish, th in French. Whereas in Italian and in Romanian, they remain. Vita is still vita in Italian, or viata in Romanian. Fuoco, foc. In terms of vocabulary, you can see the same kind of thing. So classical Latin noctem is the accusative form, the direct object form of the word for night. But the nominative, the form used as a subject, is nox, N-O-X, noxema. It's night cream. See? You didn't know that, did you? So the accusative becomes, in vulgar Latin, in spoken Latin, the final M simply drops. The Romance languages don't use endings to indicate relationships, syntactic relationships. I'll talk about that a little bit at the end. And in Western Romance, that KT, k-t sound, nocte, there is a dissimilation, so it becomes something like a noite, noite. And that's exactly what Portuguese is. It is a very archaic form. In Spanish, that y and t work on each other, and you assimilate to get noche. That's where the ch comes from. I'll show some examples from England. In Catalan, it becomes nit, where the o drops out entirely. In French, it nuit. But in the Eastern Romance, nocte becomes notte. So the KT assimilate. You get two T's out of it, notte. Linguists have a lot of fun explaining how these phonetic changes occur. The other changes that we find are archaisms, in other words, where a particular word is retained versus an innovation occurs. So, comedere, from the classical Latin, edere, to eat, becomes comer in Spanish or in Portuguese, whereas the Catalan and the French and Italian use something from manducare, from mandible, in other words, your jaw, which means essentially it's slang. It means to gobble something up. And that becomes menja in Catalan, or manger in French, or mangiare in Italian. Mangia, mangia. Mensa is table, becomes Spanish mesa, but in French they use tabula. In other words, let's not sit down. Let's sit at the picnic table, the planks. Tabula, taola, tabla, tavola, in French, Portuguese, and Spanish. Celtic words one of the things that we see happening is that there tends to be a sort of semantic specialization. A lot of the Celtic words that still are retained in these various languages have to do with agriculture or with domestic arts. So camisia is a Celtic word, gives Spanish camisa, French chemise, camisa, beer, cerveza, cerveja, but French and Italian use the Germanic word bière, birra. The French still use the old 20 system, base 20 system to count. You've got 10 fingers and 10 toes. So 80 is 80, 4 20s. 90 is 90, 4 20s plus 10. And by analogy, you get 70, which was never actually used, but it's 60 plus 10 because it makes a system with 20 plus 10. Germanic influence, there's a lot of military vocabulary because the Germans were, these were the people who were bringing new military technology in contact with the Romans. But you get, so guerra, war, are Germanic words in all of the Romance languages and in English. Riki, powerful, the Germanic Reich. Rico, rik, rish, rico, all of these words meaning power or wealth are Germanic. You sometimes find not just vocabulary words for concrete items, but also the syntactic relationships among things. So for example, in English, we say this here next to me and that over there next to you. Spanish uses a tripartite system. Este, next to me, ese next to you, and aquel over there, far away from either one of us. French uses the Germanic system, ceci, cela, aquí, here and there. Whereas the other Romance languages, Italian, Spanish, and so on, tend to use this tripartite opposition in the various demonstratives. Arabic, remember the Arabs were in the Iberian Peninsula for 8 centuries, although not all over. In Italy, in southern Italy especially, for about 2 centuries. A lot of concepts from mathematics, algebra, for example, 0 are Arabic words, and a lot of the names of things that came in with the Arabs, such as cotton, which was imported into Europe. So that's alcutn becomes algodón, cotón, cotone, naranja, orange, become naranja in Spanish, orange. What happens? Why do we have orange or the French have orange and Spanish have naranja? That's a rhetorical question. I'm going to answer it. It's because there is, when the indefinite article is un or una, so you get un orange, and there is simply a split. If you get un at the end of the article and an in at the beginning of the word, then where does the split between the article and the word take place? So in Spanish it's simply retained as the n, but in French it was lost. It was perceived as un orange, not un orange. Azúcar, again, sugar came along. Sugarcane came along with the Arabs. Storehouse. This is where we get almacén, magazine, meaning a storehouse of articles of or munitions, for example, in English. Wadi, river. Guadalquivir means literally the great river. Guadalupe means river of the wolf.
Did you just change the spellings to make the pronunciation different? Or I've never seen that spelling in French.
Which?
For orange.
That's old. That may that was Old French.
Old French.
Yeah, orange. That becomes orange in modern French. The au, for example, aurum, gold, aur becomes or in modern French. So let's look at the relationships among these languages in contact. Linguists like to use a geological metaphor. We talk about substratum and superstratum. So this is actually chronological. So the substratum are the languages which are in place. Then you get a migration and which supplants the native languages and becomes the dominant language. And then on top, after that, you get another group of people coming in who don't displace the dominant language, but they cause it to change. So you've got a substratum, you've got the dominant language, and then you've got a superstratum. In Italy, the substratum languages are Italic, Greek, or Celtic. Celtic in the north. The dominant language is Latin, obviously, and then the superstratum languages are the various Germanic languages brought in by the Ostrogoths and the Lombards, which is where we get Lombardy, Lombard Street, and of course Arabic. But even today, there isn't a standard Italian language. Almost every Italian speaks the standard language, but also the local dialect. Venetian, Bolognese, Romano, Napolitano, Siciliano. What has happened is that the dialect of Florence became the prestige dialect of Italy because of people like Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio, incredibly important authors who basically set the standard for the Italian language in the 14th and 15th centuries. Italy remains a patchwork of states until 1860. when it is finally unified. So, for example, so these are Italian dialects. This is today. So here is the Roman dialect, but all of these other ones, Piemontese around Milan, or Veneto in Venice, or here is the home of the Italian language, Tuscany, Toscano. You go to Naples, or you go to Palermo in Sicily, and what you hear in the streets is not Italian. It's Napolitano. Spain, the same kind of thing happened. So this is roughly after the Arabs come in. The Christians were up in this small area up in the north, on the other side of the mountains of Cantabria, protected by the mountains. The Muslims had covered this whole area here, except for the far northeastern corner, which is where Barcelona is, Catalunya, and this area down here, which was still part of the Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire. Over the course of time, that is actually becomes Islam as well. During the course of from roughly the 9th century onwards, the Christians began, these Christian kingdoms of the north, Galicia, Asturias, Leon, Castilla, Navarra, Aragon, begin to push south across the mountains into the high plains, the Meseta. Toledo, the former capital of Visigothic Spain, is occupied in 1086. And in the 13th century, King Ferdinand III, pushes down the valley of the Guadalquivir, the great river, in Cordoba, in Seville, and finally in 1260 his son conquers Cadiz. So eventually Spain goes from, the Roman-speaking parts of Spain go from north to south. And what happens during this process is that the Kingdom of Castile is much more dynamic. It pushes the other languages to the side. So it pushes Galician down to the western borders, and that's where Portuguese comes from. It pushes Catalan off to the east, and becomes the Castilian monarchy and the Castilian language become dominant in the Iberian Peninsula. The Kingdom of Granada remains until 1492. Granada is conquered in January 2nd, 1492. Ferdinand and Isabel issue the Edict of Expulsion of the Jews in March 31st of 1492. Columbus set sail on August 3rd, 1492. The Spaniards call this the Annus Mirabilis, the Year of Miracles. That's another lecture. So in Spanish, we've got the substratum languages are the languages that were spoken in Spain before the Romans came. We don't even know what Iberian is. There are symbols, but no one's been able to decipher them. But that is the original language spoken by the Basques today. And it obviously has changed over a period of 2,500, 3,000 years. And of course Celtic as well, especially in the northern part of Spain. The Basques are still fighting to remain independent after 2,500 years. They were the last part of Spain to be conquered by the Romans, and they are still fighting the Spanish government, the French governments today. This is a lot like Afghanistan. Afghanistan has been fighting to be independent since Alexander the Great. No one has ever been able to conquer the Afghans permanently. The superstratum language, Visigothic, Arabic, Visigothic first, then Arabic, then gradually pushing back south. The Alfonso the Learned plays the role in Spain that Petrarch, Dante, and Boccaccio played in Italy. He sets the standard for Castilian language in the second half, of the 13th century. He writes the major law code. He has an immense number of scientific works translated from Arabic into Spanish. These originally were Greek, Syriac, Arabic, and then Latin and Spanish. He writes the massive histories, the general historia, the general history of the world, from the beginning, obviously, the creation, up until the birth of Christ. This was just published in 2009 in 10 volumes, 6,000 pages. I mean, it's big. And then Nebrija, this is the other thing that happened in 1490. He publishes the first printed grammar of a modern language. And he dedicates it to Queen Isabel. Because in his dedication, he says, we see in all of our historical studies that language was always the companion of empire. La lengua siempre fue compañera del imperio. And you are going to create an empire. And he was right. Spain created an empire. And Nebrija provided the tools to teach the natives in America the Spanish language. Philip II presided over the greatest extension of the Spanish Empire. I mean, there's, why did Spanish use the th, the theta, caza? It's not because Philip lisps. I mean, you can trace these changes back over a long period of time. But Spanish has a phoneme, Peninsular Spanish has a phoneme, a significant sound that does not exist in Latin American Spanish. So the Spaniards can make a distinction between caza, the hunt, and casa, the house. In Mexico, casa meaning to hunt and casa meaning the house are the same word. And cazar, to hunt, and casar, to marry, are the same word. So you can think about that a little bit. In France, same situation. This area was the center of the Frankish kingdom, which was centered around Paris, which is still called the Ile-de-France. Whereas in the south, in Provence, there was a much lighter influence of Germanic languages. And so Provençal and French are really quite different. And if a normal French person cannot understand, who only speaks French natively, doesn't understand Provençal. Same thing, the substratum is Celtic. When Caesar arrives in 51 BC, the natives are speaking Celtic languages. The superstratum are basically the Germanic language, Frankish, Burgundian in the Far East, Norman, which is a Germanic language, but coming much later and from Scandinavia, and Provençal. The Norman conquest is where of England, where what is brought is was French spoken in the 11th century, but with a heavy admixture of Germanic terms. And so we still get these kinds of distinctions. Ox is a Germanic word. Beef is a French word. So boeuf, beef is what you eat, because that was on the table of the Lord. The ox is what the peasants in the field had to take care of. Same thing with sheep. Mouton, mutton, is what you eat. In the beginning of the 13th century, the northern French took essentially the south on the basis of a religious crusade against the Cathars, who were dualists. In other words, they believed that instead of one God, there were actually two. There was a God who was in charge of this world, who was essentially the devil, and then there was the real God. And for the church, this was heresy. They got the King of France to declare to participate in a crusade, and northern French took over the south over a period of about 40 years. And this was not pretty. This is where the Inquisition was founded in order to extirpate the heretics. When the French occupied the city of Béziers, then down in the in Languedoc in the south of France, the soldiers came to the bishop who was in charge of the crusade and said, we've got Cathars, we've got Catholics here, we don't know which is which. We have to separate them out. And the bishop said, kill them all. God will know which is are his own. I don't know if that's true or not, but as the Italians say, si non è vero è ben trovato. We still make this distinction between Languedoc and Languedoc, meaning the two ways you say yes. In the south of France, it's oc. And in northern France, it's oui, or oui, today. France was probably the first of the states to become heavily centralized. And it was the first one to establish an academy to monitor the French language so that, and decide which words were all right. The French do not like le weekend or le jogging, and they talk about franglais, which is this horrible corruption. Let's see, I've got a little bit more time here. Okay, so those are the kinds of processes that determine how languages change because of people coming into contact. Whereas languages also change internally because sounds come into contact, or syntactic structures become more simplified, or there's a distinction between the way people speak when they're giving a lecture, the way I'm speaking now, and the way you speak when you're among your friends. A formal register versus a spoken register. Sound changes. When in vulgar Latin, when the final endings were dropped, all of a sudden you couldn't tell whether a noun was a subject or a direct object or an indirect object. So you needed other ways to figure that out. In Spanish, you can say things like Juan, well, I'll do it with a dog. El perro muerde Juan, or Juan muerde el perro. And you don't know which of those things. In English, you have to use a very definite word order to indicate the direct object. But in Spanish, you don't. The direct object can come before the verb instead of after. Morphological change. I talked about the loss of the various case endings, or analogy. We see this with children when they're learning their verb forms. He go to the store. Well, why? Well, because the way you make a verb past tense is you add ed on the end of it. And it takes them a while to realize that some verbs are irregular. Those kinds of processes happen in the language all the time. Syntactic changes. This is the most important. Subject, object, verb, as opposed, or subject, verb, object. English is a subject, verb, object language. Latin was a subject, object, verb language. And so a lot of these relationships that used to be governed by case endings have to be signified by the use of prepositions. And I'll give you some examples about that as well. So, what are you going to do? No one would say that. What you going to do? What are you going to do? What are you going to do? Or, what you going to do? You know, when you're learning a foreign language, you've got to get to that stage instead of that stage. But this whatcha, this is the effect of the same thing that we have seen in Spanish with nocte becoming noche. This whatcha, where this y sound influences the t to get the ch. Where do we see we can trace these processes very far back. In Pompeii, for example, graffiti on the walls. They're written by people who are basically illiterate. The same kind of thing you see on the walls today. And so we can see what spoken Latin was like on the basis of the kinds of mistakes that people are making. Probus was a Latin grammarian from the 6th century, so this is fairly late, 500 AD roughly. And at the end, someone has added as an appendix to his treatise on Latin grammar a list of mistakes that people make that you shouldn't make. So, example, you're supposed to say vetulus, non veclus. And of course, veclus is what gives Spanish viejo or Italian vecchio. You're supposed to say vinea, not vigna. And vigna in French or in Spanish. Oculus, not oculus. So what's happening is what's intertonic vowel, this weak vowel is being lost. And that brings into contact two consonants, and the consonants in turn affect each other. And a couple of other processes. Assimilation. When two sounds come into contact, they sometimes become more like each other. Or sometimes, in order to maintain the distinction, they will become less like each other. And it's not, there's not a formula. So let's take lactem, milk. In Portuguese, originally this is leite. Well, the original form is leite in Portuguese, Spanish, and French. And then leite, and that's what it winds up in Portuguese, leite. In Spanish, it comes leite. So the a, which is a very low vowel, and this I, which is a very high vowel, tend to they assimilate together to become a mid vowel, an a. And then the leite, this J, which is spelled as a J, which is actually a very high glide sound, affects the T, and that's where we get the leche. In French, you get the same process here, but instead of the assimilation of the T simply drops. And that's where we get lait, café au lait. And this is probably the effect of Germanic, of Frankish on French, where it's a much heavier stress in the Germanic languages than Latin. So it tends to give more prominence to the stressed syllable and less to the unstressed syllables. Italian, lactem gives latte. Well, this is, what would Starbucks do without latte? And that's an assimilation. The K and the T come together, and the K is simply assimilated into the. But you sometimes find things like mediodías, the middle of the day, where you have a dissimilation to meridies, which is where we get meridian. In other words, the two Ds are too much alike for. This is not conscious. This is people thinking. You're not thinking about it, but simply reacting subconsciously. And so the D changes to an R, which is pronounced roughly in the same part of the mouth. Hominem is one of my favorite words. It becomes homine. This intertonic, this weak syllable drops out and becomes omne, and this is the form that you find in Old Spanish. But the M and the N are both nasals, and it's hard to maintain the distinction. So one of two things will happen. One, the N will drop and we'll get homme, which is what happened in French, homme, or the N will dissimilate to R, and that's what happened in Spanish. So you get hombre, M-R, and then you need, this B develops as a sort of a buffer consonant between the M and the R, and that's where hombre comes. And the H is not pronounced, but it's the etymological H from Latin, homines. I've never heard this said in English, but this is the example that linguists give. Chimney becomes dialectal chimley, and apparently there are places where people say chimbley. Has anybody ever heard that? Chimbley? No, okay. Me neither. Vocabulary changes take place. Typically what happens is that words of less phonetic substance are replaced by longer words. Slang takes over. So auris is ear in Latin, oral, but auricula means your little ear, and that's where we get oreja, the Spanish from. So it doesn't mean your little ear anymore, it just means ear. Os in Latin, from there it's where we get oral, os oris. But in the Romance languages, what the word for mouth is now based on bucca, the inflated cheek. Well, and bocca, bush in Italian. Equus, horse, but caballus. This is a nag. This is an old broken down horse, as opposed to the kind of thing that a Roman soldier might ride. So cavallo, cheval, caval, and so on and so forth. Verbum, but the normal word in the Romance languages is parole. This is actually Christian Latin. We're talking about the parables in the Bible, but originally it's Greek. It means word. Words change their meanings over time. In Spanish, legitimate means legitima, but through sound change becomes lidima, lidma, lidma, linda. And that's where, so linda originally comes from legitima, pretty. Mi linda mujer did not mean my pretty wife, it meant my legitimate wife. So, and you get crosses. Stella is the Latin form, but astrum is also a Latin form. And Stella gives étoile, but Stella plus astrum gives estrella. And this is kind of fun, mazel, as in muzzle tough, comes into Spanish as desmacelado. In other words, a word from Hebrew is incorporated into Spanish, gets a Latin prefix and a Latin suffix, and it means unlucky. There's a lot of analogical changes. I accept is to I accepted, is I eat, is I eated. Kid, you hear this? No, I ate. In Spanish, dico, I say, first person singular present tense, becomes dico, digo, D in French with the loss of that D. And that's a perfectly straight etymological change, and it's easy to see. You cannot get vengo from venio. What's happened is that this g has propagated itself from words where it's etymologically current to where it is an analogy to these other forms. So digo, dices, dice, vengo. Never mind, I won't go into the whole thing. Same thing with tengo, I have. This is called, the linguist, the velar insert. Finally, this is the last thing we're going to do. Okay, so word order. This is probably the most complex thing. Marcus gives his father the book. In classical Latin, this Marcus, subject, patre, to his father, librum, the book, gives. Subject, object, verb. In vulgar Latin, where the words haven't changed all that much, but it's Marcus dat libru ad patre. So subject, verb, direct object. Notice it's lost its ending. And patri has also lost its ending. There's no longer a distinction between the length of the vowels. So you've got to add you have to add a preposition. Marcus gives the book to his father. In Proto-Romance, Marcos dat ille libro al suo patre. And this originally would have meant something like Marcus gives that book to his father. Latin didn't use indefinite or definite articles. And this ille, which is originally a demonstrative, this, that, becomes simply a definite article. So in Spanish, then, Marcos da el libro a su padre, Marc donne son père le livre, where we're using donner instead of donare instead of dare. Marco da el libro a suo padre. And again, linguists have a lot of fun tracing these kinds of categorizing languages and trying to trace the way syntax has changed. Okay. That went a little bit longer than I want, so we've got at least 5 minutes for questions, if you can still, if you're not stunned. Yeah?
Simple question. How many languages do you speak?
English. No, my Spanish is good. As I spent my junior year in Spain, and I can handle most of the Romance languages. I can make myself understood in French and Italian and Portuguese and Catalan. And then reading is a lot easier. Yeah.
There was a program on Science Friday, and there was a linguist that compared Bushman, the Gaelic language, with Hawaiian language. And it was really interesting.
Yeah, well, that I think was exactly what I was talking about with that, the origins of the various languages, whereas the Bushmen, in fact, have a very rich sound system, whereas Hawaiian has a very poor sound system. And this is the extremes of that change that I was talking about.
Have you correlated that in any way to the wealth of
No, I doubt it. This is really, I mean, this is research that was just published about a week ago. So the linguists are going to jump all over it. I've already, when I was looking, trying to find that slide, there's some guy saying, well, you know, this is all based on this statistical, I mean, this atlas of world languages, and that's compiled by people with very different criteria for what a sound is and significant. And so, you know, this is going to be fought over for a long time.
The author of that article, the name of the author?
Quentin Atkinson. Quentin Atkinson. And it was published in Science.
Where did gender identity and birth come from in the Romance languages?
Where does,
The gender identity?
well, that goes way back. I mean, the Indo-Europe, all the Indo-European languages have gender.
And so was the articles then brought in by the Germanic languages?
I don't know. I can't tell you. But what's really interesting, of course, is that there is no criteria. For example, in German, Mund is masculine. In Spanish, it's feminine. No, I mean there is. Yeah.
We had a project in the class about the origins of the Basque language and
Yep.
how different it was from the other languages in the Iberian Peninsula. Do you have an opinion about where that came from, or?
There are about as many opinions as there are scholars who study Basque. I mean, the one I've heard that kind of makes sense is that it is a remnant of whatever language was being spoken in Europe before the Indo-Europeans came in, and it was basically pushed back into the mountains in the Pyrenees. Some people say that there are resemblances with some of the languages that are spoken in the Caucasus, which are also mountain language, Chechen, for example. And it's the same thing. In other words, these tribes would take refuge in the mountains when these invaders would come in. But there is no, I mean, I don't study this, but people say that there really, this is an unknown question. It has no other, you know, close known language cognates. Yes.
Can you explain the plethora of consonants in Welsh?
Nope. It's a Celtic language, but I have, you know, when I see names in Wales, and you know, it's sort of like, how do you pronounce that, kind of thing. No, I don't know.
Well, let's all give our appreciation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Really, just a wonderful lecture. Thank you so much. So we will see all of you.